For 2 years, Wallace lived with the official story. His son, Dean, an experienced kayaker, was claimed by the unforgiving Everglades. He never believed it. The explanation felt too simple, too clean. The silence was broken by a call from the Collier County Sheriff. A fisherman had found Dean's signature dry bag, the one covered in national park patches, resting on a mud bank. But it wasn't alone. It was sitting beside a 12-foot alligator, as if the beast were guarding it. What really happens when the official story just doesn't add up? Stick with me as we unravel a mystery that proves a father's intuition is one of the most powerful forces on Earth. The drive to the sheriff's station in Naples was a blur of palm trees and suffocating humidity. Wallace kept the air conditioning on full blast, but a cold sweat trickled down his back. For 730 days, he had existed in a state of suspended grief. His relationship with Dean had been strained for years, a casualty of Wallace's expectations and Dean's stubborn refusal to meet them. They hadn't spoken for 6 months before his son vanished. The official report, kayak likely capsized, victim presumed taken by wildlife, had felt like a sterile, impersonal end to a life that, for all its troubles, had been vibrant and full of restless energy. An accident felt wrong. Dean knew those waters better than he knew himself. A young deputy with a kind face and a name tag that read Chen met him in the lobby. She led him to a sterile interview room where a lime green bag sat in the center of a metal table. Wallace's breath caught in his throat. It was Dean's. There was the faded patch from Zion, the one from Yosemite, the brand new one from Big Bend he'd bought for a trip they were supposed to take together. A trip that never happened. Each patch was a tiny monument to their fractured relationship, to plans made and broken. A base fisherman found it this morning, Deputy Chen explained, her voice soft. He was in a channel off the Turner River. Said he saw the color from 100 yards away. When he got closer to retrieve it, a big gator surfaced right next to it, just sat there, watching him. Wallace ran a hand over the bag's durable, waterproof fabric. It wasn't torn? No bite marks? None, she confirmed. The fisherman said it was the strangest thing he'd ever seen. He backed off and called Fish and Wildlife, and they called us. We've logged it and checked the contents for any immediate evidence. It's been officially processed. Now it's yours. The contents were laid out next to the bag, a half-empty plastic water bottle, a foil granola bar wrapper, and a thick black pelican case, the kind used to protect expensive electronics. Wallace frowned. That was the first thing that felt off. Dean's phone had been a cheap, cracked screen Android. He wouldn't have spent $100 on a case for a $50 phone. Is that everything? Wallace asked, his voice raspy. That's it, Chen said. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Hayes. I hope this brings some closure. Wallace nodded, unable to speak. He packed the items back into the bag, the pelican case feeling unnaturally heavy in his hand. Closure? This wasn't closure. This was a key turning in a lock he thought had been rusted shut forever. He drove home, the green bag sitting on the passenger seat like a silent accusation. The official story was a lie, and Dean's bag was going to help him prove it. Back in the quiet of his small home, Wallace placed the bag on his kitchen table. The silence of the house, once a dull ache, was now filled with a thrumming energy. He examined the pelican case. It was sealed tight, designed to withstand immense pressure and water damage. It took him 20 minutes with a flathead screwdriver to carefully pry it open without breaking the seal. Inside, nestled in the foam padding, was a satellite phone. Wallace stared at it. A sat phone. Not a cheap Android. These things were expensive, with even more expensive service plans. They were for people who needed to communicate from the most remote places on Earth, far from any cell tower. Why would Dean, who could barely afford his rent, have one of these? He pressed the power button. Nothing. The battery was completely dead. A quick search online led him to a universal charger for that model. He ordered it with next-day delivery. The next 24 hours were the longest of his life. He paced his house, the bag sitting on his table like a dormant beast. His mind replayed every argument he'd ever had with his son. He'd called Dean a drifter, a man without ambition. Dean had fired back that Wallace only measured success in dollars and corner offices, that he didn't understand the freedom of living a life untethered. Maybe Dean was right. In his push to make his son more like him, had he pushed him into a world he knew nothing about? A world that required burner phones and secret communications? The charger arrived the next afternoon. With trembling hands, Wallace plugged it in and connected it to the phone. A red light blinked on. It was charging. After an hour, he tried the power button again. The screen flickered to life, displaying a welcome logo, followed by a password screen. Of course. A password. He spent the next 2 hours trying every combination he could think of. Dean's birthday, his mother's birthday, their old dog's name, the make of his first car, the high school mascot. Nothing worked. Each failed attempt felt like another door slamming shut in his face. Defeated, he slumped into a chair, staring at the useless phone. He decided to go through the bag one more time, meticulously checking every seam and pocket. His fingers found a small, almost invisible zippered pouch on the inside lining. He'd missed it the first time. He pulled the zipper and his fingers brushed against something small and leathery. He pulled it out. It was a small black moleskin notebook, the waterproof kind used by hikers and field researchers. His heart pounded as he opened it. The pages were filled with his son's familiar, messy handwriting. But it wasn't a journal, it was a ledger. The entries were cryptic, a series of codes and numbers. A typical line read, June 14th, site G4X Rosie, 1X Alba, 12C Southern 500. The pages were full of entries like this, spanning over a year. What was Rosie? What was Alba? What were these sites? And where was all this money coming from? Wallace grabbed his laptop. He typed Rosie Everglades into the search bar. The first result was about the Rosie boa, a small, beautiful snake native to the West Coast, a popular but highly regulated pet. Poaching and illegal sales were a major issue. His blood ran cold. He searched for Alba Everglades. The results were about the alligator snapping turtle, a protected species often illegally harvested for its meat and shells. The notebook fell from his hands. This wasn't a journal of a nature-loving kayaker. It was the account book of a criminal. His son, the boy he'd argued with about getting a real job, had been making thousands of dollars poaching and smuggling rare and protected animals out of the very wilderness he claimed to love. The irony was a bitter pill. The pain of this discovery was sharp, a betrayal that cut deeper than their years of estrangement. But beneath the pain was a cold, hard clarity. This was the motive. An accident was random. This kind of business, this kind of money, was not. People who dealt in these circles didn't just have accidents, they made enemies. He scanned the ledger again, his eyes searching for a name, anything to connect this operation to another person, and then he saw it. A name written next to several of the largest payments, over $50,000 each. Corbin. The name hit Wallace like a punch to the gut. Corbin Hale. Dean's best friend from high school, a smooth-talking kid Wallace had never trusted. The kind of friend who was always encouraging Dean's worst impulses. He hadn't heard that name in over a decade. He thought Corbin had moved out of state. Suddenly an idea sparked. A long shot. He picked up the satellite phone and looked at the password screen. He thought back to their high school days, to the one thing that had bonded Dean and Corbin more than anything. He slowly typed in the name of their high school mascot, a word he hadn't thought of in 20 years. Warhawks. The phone unlocked. The screen displayed a simple home screen with only a few apps. The text message icon had one unread notification. He opened it. There were only a handful of conversations, all with a single contact simply labeled C. The messages were short, direct, and logistical. Coordinates for meeting spots, times for pickups, confirmation of payments. Then he saw the last two messages, sent the day before Dean disappeared. The first was from Dean, got the last of it. It's a full load. Where do you want to meet? The final message was from C, from Corbin. Site B is hot. FWC are sniffing around. We need to clear out. Meet me at the usual spot. Bring everything. Wallace stared at the screen, the words burning into his memory. Bring everything. Corbin had lured him out there. An FWC raid meant their operation was about to collapse. Corbin, spooked and greedy, must have decided to take the final valuable shipment and eliminate his partner, the only person who could link him to the crimes. He killed my son, Wallace thought, the realization settling in his chest with the weight of a tombstone. He looked through the ledger one last time. In the very back, tucked into a paper flap, was a small, hand-drawn map. It was a section of the 10,000 Islands, a maze of mangrove estuaries south of Marco Island. One small unnamed island was circled in red ink. A single word was written next to it. Dock. The usual spot. Wallace knew he couldn't go to the police. A few cryptic texts and a hand-drawn map weren't enough. They would call it circumstantial, tell him he was a grieving father grasping at straws. If he wanted justice for Dean, he would have to get it himself. He needed a confession. He looked up Corbin Hale online. It didn't take long to find him. He was the owner of Hale's Herpetological Imports, a licensed and seemingly legitimate exotic animal business operating out of a warehouse in Fort Myers. A perfect front. Wallace picked up his own phone, his thumb hovering over the call button. He took a deep breath, steeling his nerves. He knew what he had to say. He would become a new buyer, someone interested in the kind of rare, off-the-books merchandise that Corbin specialized in. He would bait the hook, and he would reel in his son's killer. The next morning, Wallace drove to a big-box electronics store and bought a small, high-fidelity audio recorder, the kind that could be concealed in a shirt pocket. He spent the afternoon practicing with it, making sure he knew how to operate it without looking. He then called the number listed on Corbin's website. A smooth, confident voice answered. Hale's Herpetological. This is Corbin. Wallace's grip tightened on the phone. He pitched his voice lower, adding a slight, gravelly tone. I'm calling about a private acquisition. A mutual friend, Dean Hayes, suggested you were the man to talk to. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a long, heavy silence. Wallace let the silence stretch, knowing the first person to speak would lose control. Finally, Corbin's voice returned, cautious and strained. Dean, I haven't heard from him in a couple of years. I heard he had an accident. Accidents happen, Wallace said coolly, but business continues. He told me if I ever needed a few Rosies or a prime Alba, you were the only reliable source in Florida. Another silence. Wallace could almost hear the gears turning in Corbin's head. The mention of their code names was the hook. It proved he was either a past client or someone who had access to their operation's secrets. I don't know what you're talking about, Corbin said, but his denial was weak. Look, Wallace pressed. I have a client in from overseas with deep pockets. He's not interested in your licensed stock. He wants the real deal. If you're not interested, I can find someone who is. But the money is good. Greed. Wallace was counting on it. It was the motive for Dean's murder, and he hoped it would be the motive for Corbin's mistake. After a moment, Corbin relented. All right, where are you? I'm in Naples. I can be in Fort Myers this afternoon. No, Corbin said quickly. Not at my office. Too much traffic. There's a warehouse district off I-75. I'll text you the address, Unit 12. Be there at 5 o'clock. And come alone. I'll be there, Wallace said, and hung up. He sat in his car for a long time, his heart hammering against his ribs. The plan was in motion. He was going to walk into a warehouse to confront the man who had murdered his son. He wasn't a young man anymore, and Corbin was in his prime. It was a foolish, dangerous idea. But as he looked at the green dry bag sitting in his passenger seat, he knew he had no other choice. This was the final trip he and Dean would take together. Wallace arrived at the warehouse district 45 minutes early. It was a desolate area of identical, beige buildings baking under the relentless Florida sun. He parked across the street from Unit 12 and watched. At 10 minutes to 5, a sleek black pickup truck pulled up and Corbin Hale got out. He was just as Wallace remembered. Handsome, athletic, with an easy confidence that Wallace now saw as a predator's swagger. At 5 o'clock sharp, Wallace got out of his car activated the recorder in his pocket, and walked across the asphalt. Corbin was waiting by the door, his arms crossed. His friendly smile didn't reach his eyes. "You must be my new client," Corbin said, extending a hand. Wallace ignored it. "Let's talk inside," Wallace said, his voice flat. Corbin's smile faltered. He unlocked the door and led Wallace into the cavernous space. The air was thick with the musky smell of reptiles. Rows of terrariums lined the walls, filled with snakes, lizards, and turtles, all silent witnesses. Corbin gestured to a small office area with a metal desk and 2 chairs. "So, what can I do for you?" Wallace didn't sit. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the satellite phone, placing it on the desk. Then he pulled out the moleskin ledger and placed it next to the phone. Corbin stared at the items, his face draining of all color. He looked up at Wallace, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Who are you?" "My name is Wallace Hayes," he said, his voice quiet but heavy. "Dean was my son." The confident mask shattered. Corbin stumbled back, knocking into a rack of empty tanks. I don't understand. They said a gator. There was no gator. Was there, Corbin? Wallace took a step forward. There was just you. You and a full shipment of animals you didn't want to share. You and the FWC closing in on your little operation. "No, you've got it all wrong," Corbin stammered, holding up his hands. "Dean was my friend. I would never—" "Save it," Wallace cut him off. "I read the texts. I read the ledger. I know you lured him out to the dock. The last big score. Right before you cut him loose. Or did you just cut him out?" Corbin's eyes darted around the warehouse, looking for an escape. He was trapped. "Why, Corbin?" Wallace asked, the question raw, with 2 years of unanswered pain. "He trusted you. He was your friend." Corbin finally broke. His shoulders slumped, and he sank into one of the chairs, burying his face in his hands. "I didn't want to," he mumbled, his voice thick with self-pity. "He wouldn't listen. FWC had an informant. They were going to raid us. I told him we had to sink the shipment, lay low for a year. But he wouldn't do it. He had a buyer lined up, said it was too much money to walk away from." He looked up at Wallace, his eyes pleading. "We argued. He got physical. He tried to leave with the shipment. It happened. I didn't plan it, I swear." "So you killed him," Wallace said, the words like stones in his mouth. "And you left him in the swamp." Corbin nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I took his kayak and his body, and I sank them in the deep channel with cinder blocks. I threw his bag into the shallows in a place I knew was crawling with gators. I thought it would get torn to shreds, or if it was found, it would look like an attack. I never imagined it would just float there for 2 years." At that moment, the warehouse door rolled open with a loud metallic groan. Deputy Chen stood in the opening, flanked by 2 other uniformed officers, their hands on their holsters. "Corbin Hale," she said, her voice echoing in the large space. "You're under arrest for the murder of Dean Hayes." Corbin stared at them, then back at Wallace, his expression one of utter defeat. Wallace hadn't come alone. He had called Deputy Chen before he left Naples, telling her his suspicions and where he was going. He had gambled that she would believe him, or at least believe enough to be nearby. As the officers cuffed a sobbing Corbin and read him his rights, Wallace felt the tension of the last 2 years drain out of him, leaving him feeling hollow and exhausted. He had the truth. He had justice. But it didn't bring his son back. A week later, Wallace stood on a small tour boat in the 10,000 Islands, not far from where the fisherman had found Dean's bag. The authorities, guided by Corbin's confession, had searched the deep channel for weeks, but the currents were too strong. Dean's body was never recovered. This place would have to be his final resting place. Wallace held a single white rose. He thought about the son he had lost twice, once to the swamp and again to the truth. He would never fully understand the choices Dean made, the secret life he led. But in the end, he was still his son. He tossed the rose into the dark, brackish water and watched as the current carried it away, out toward the Gulf. He had closure. Not the clean, simple kind the world promises, but a messy, painful, and true closure. And for now, it was enough. So, what do you think? If Wallace had known about his son's illegal activities earlier, did he have a father's duty to turn him in or to protect him? Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking and subscribing. Every bit of support helps us continue to bring these important stories to light. Thank you for listening.